My son took me to an estate wellness day after my wife passed away, saying it was part of a healing legacy planning retreat, something to help me organize my affairs after loss. But I never expected that the moment he walked out of that building, everything would start falling apart. She pulled me aside like she had been waiting for me. The receptionist grabbed my sleeve and whispered, "Don't sign a single page." My son disappeared down the hallway like it was nothing, and suddenly I was left alone in a glass-walled room surrounded by smiling strangers and legal papers already laid out with my name on them. Something about the way they looked at me felt rehearsed, like I wasn't a person but a signature waiting to happen, and in that moment I realized I had walked into something I didn't understand at all. Something far bigger than a simple family appointment, and something was already wrong before I even sat down. If this story speaks to your heart, or if it resonates with something you've ever felt in your own family, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe. It truly helps these stories reach more people who need to hear them, and I would also love to know where you are watching from, your city or country, and what time it is for you right now in your part of the world, because somehow these stories feel different depending on where they are heard. My name is Robert Mitchell. I am 72 years old, and what I am about to tell you happened in one long afternoon in Scottsdale, Arizona, inside a place that was supposed to help families find clarity after loss. But instead it revealed how quickly trust can be rewritten when you are no longer paying attention. And if there is one thing I learned that day, it is that silence in a family is never empty. It is always filled with something else, something waiting. And the real lesson of this story is not about money or paperwork, but about how easily a man can be guided into losing control of his own life without ever realizing it. So stay with me until the end, because what I discovered about my wife's hidden preparations changed everything I thought I knew about my own family. And now let me take you back to how it all began. The building itself looked nothing like danger. It was polished glass and warm wood in the middle of the Arizona desert, the kind of place that called itself a wellness retreat, but smelled faintly of printer, ink, and corporate patience. My son Kevin drove me there from Phoenix in silence that felt too careful, too structured, like he had already rehearsed every word he was going to say before we even arrived. And when we pulled into the parking lot, he placed his hand briefly on my shoulder and said, "Dad, today is just about making things easier. After Mom passed, we need clarity." I remember nodding, because nodding is what fathers do when they are tired and don't want conflict. But something in his voice didn't sound like care. It sounded like completion. Inside, the air was too cool, too controlled. Every smile at the front desk arrived too quickly, and a woman with a neat name tag that read Sarah Collins looked at my file longer than she should have before saying, "Mr. Laugh. Mitchell, we are just waiting for your son to finish a quick signature review upstairs." Her tone was polite, but her eyes were not. They kept flicking back to the folder as if it didn't belong to me at all. And when Kevin finally led me into a conference room, I noticed how the papers were already aligned perfectly, pin-placed at the exact angle, every page marked with yellow tabs, like someone had already decided the outcome of my day. "It's standard trust maintenance," Kevin said with a calm smile, sliding the documents closer to me. "Mom would have wanted everything updated. You know how complicated these things get." I looked at him, and for a moment I almost believed him, because sons are supposed to be trusted. But then I noticed how quickly he looked away when I asked one simple question: "Why does this need to be signed today?" And that hesitation lingered in the room longer than any answer he gave. The receptionist Sarah appeared again at the door, this time not smiling, and she said something to Kevin I couldn't hear, but I saw his expression tighten slightly before he excused himself. "I'll be right back, Dad. Just stay here." And that was the last calm sentence anyone spoke, because the moment he left, the atmosphere changed completely, like the room had exhaled. Sarah stepped closer then, lowering her voice so only I could hear. And what she said did not sound like advice. It sounded like warning. "Don't sign a single page." I remember staring at her, because people do not usually risk their jobs for strangers. And before I could ask her why, she slid a small printed sheet across the table, and my eyes caught a line at the top that made no sense in the context of what Kevin had told me. Something about amended authority and pre-approved consent. And in that moment I realized my name might already be moving through systems I had not agreed to. Down the hallway I could hear Kevin's voice speaking too quickly to someone on the phone. And for the first time since arriving, I noticed how many doors this building actually had, all of them closed, all of them quiet. And I felt a strange weight settle in my chest, not fear exactly, but recognition. like standing in a room where a conversation had already started long before you entered it. And then Sarah looked at me one more time and said, "Sir, I think your wife left something behind that you were never meant to see." And just as she finished speaking, I saw Kevin return at the end of the corridor, but something about the way he was walking told me the situation had already changed in a way none of them were going to explain. I remained seated in that glass room long after the sound of footsteps in the hallway faded, my hands resting on the edge of the table without touching the papers in front of me, because something about them no longer felt like paperwork. It felt like intention, and intention is always heavier than ink. I remember Sarah Collins standing near the door for a moment longer than she needed to, as if she was deciding whether a warning was enough or whether she had already said too much. Then she left quietly, and the silence she left behind was not empty. It was structured, almost like it had been arranged the same way the documents on the table were arranged. And in that stillness, my mind began to drift backward without permission, not to the present moment, but to everything that had led me here. Because nothing in a family arrives without history. And I had learned long ago that silence is never the beginning of a story. It is the accumulation of everything that was never said out loud. I thought about Kevin as a boy first, not the man who had just walked out of the room speaking in careful financial language, but the boy who used to sit on the kitchen floor in Seattle building towers out of wooden blocks while Eleanor cooked dinner and hummed softly like the house itself had a heartbeat. I can still hear her voice saying, "Robert, let him build it his way," whenever I tried to correct the angles of his imagination. And I remember laughing at the time because I thought structure was something you teach, not something you inherit. But Eleanor always believed children reveal themselves slowly, like weather patterns, not sudden events. I looked down at my hands and realized they still remembered the weight of those early years more clearly than the present moment. And then Kevin's voice entered my memory the way it used to when he was younger, not sharp, not controlling, but uncertain, like a man still asking permission to exist in his own home. "Dad, you never understand how complicated things are," he used to say during the years after college when money first started to feel like something that could slip away rather than something that simply existed. And I would answer too quickly back then, always thinking clarity could fix tension. "Complicated does not mean impossible, Kevin," I would say, and he would look at me in that quiet way sons look when they stop asking their fathers for guidance and start asking the world instead. But the real fracture did not begin with money. It began with absence. Eleanor used to manage everything in a way that made responsibility invisible. Bills, documents, medical paperwork, investments. She carried all of it like it was part of breathing, and I never questioned how much she was holding until she was no longer there to hold it. I remember the hospital room in Seattle, the pale light through the blinds, Kevin standing near the window scrolling on his phone because he could not stand still for long conversations about things that could not be fixed, and Eleanor reaching for my hand and saying softly, "Do not let urgency decide anything for you after I am gone." And at the time I thought she was talking about grief, but now I understand she was talking about people. I leaned back in the chair in the Scottsdale office and felt the memory settle heavier in my chest, because urgency was exactly what had filled the retreat from the moment we arrived. Everything was immediate, everything was framed as necessary, and Kevin had been using that word all day. Necessary, as if repetition could replace consent. I remembered a conversation from 2 years ago when he visited my house in Seattle during a cold November rain, standing in my kitchen while I poured coffee, saying, "Dad, you should let me handle the trust documents now. It is safer this way." And I had asked him then, "Safer for whom?" And he had smiled in a way that did not reach his eyes. "For you, of course," he said. But Eleanor's absence had already begun to change the meaning of words like that. Safety, care, responsibility. They all started to feel slightly misaligned, as if spoken through different intentions than the ones I remembered. I closed my eyes for a moment and heard Eleanor again, not as a memory but as something closer to instruction. "If you ever feel rushed, you are already being guided," she had told me once while sitting at the edge of our bed in the quiet years before illness took her strength, and I had nodded without fully understanding, because I thought guidance came from trust, not pressure. I opened my eyes again and saw the reflection of the room in the glass wall, the empty chairs, the perfectly aligned folders, the pen still waiting like it had patience beyond human limits, and I realized something uncomfortable was forming beneath all of this, not just suspicion but recognition, because this was not the first time Kevin had controlled the direction of conversation without announcing it. There had been smaller versions of this moment for years. Subtle rearrangements of decisions, delayed communications, softened truths, like someone slowly turning down the volume of my access to my own life, and I had mistaken it for efficiency. I heard footsteps outside the door again and thought it might be Kevin returning, but instead it was Sarah Collins hesitating in the hallway, her voice lower now when she spoke through the glass. "Mr. Mitchell, I checked something in your file," she said, pausing as if the next words were heavier than she expected. "There are modifications here that do not match the original authorization timeline." And I felt my attention sharpen in a way it had not in years, not like fear, but like procedure returning to memory. Because in my past life, nothing important ever depended on one document alone. There was always a backup, always a second layer, always something waiting beneath what was visible. And then Sarah added quietly, almost reluctantly, "And your son did not initiate those changes when he said he did." And at that exact moment, I understood that what I was sitting inside was not simply a misunderstanding between father and son. It was something that had already been moving forward, long before I ever walked into that building. Something that had been prepared in silence. And as I turned my head slightly toward the hallway where Kevin had disappeared earlier, I noticed for the first time that the light outside the room had changed. Not brighter, not darker, but controlled, as if even time in this place was being managed by someone else. And I realized I was no longer waiting for an explanation. I was waiting for confirmation of something I was suddenly afraid I already knew. I noticed the change in Kevin's footsteps before I saw him again. Not because I could see him, but because the air in the hallway shifted the way it does before a conversation becomes a confrontation. And when the door opened, he was no longer the calm voice I had followed into this building. He was something more contained, more deliberate, and the first thing he said was not an explanation but a correction. "Dad, we are almost done. You are overthinking this." His voice carried the same tone I had heard years ago when decisions were already made without me and I was simply being informed after the fact. I looked at him and asked quietly, "What exactly is almost done?" And he smiled in that practiced way people use when they believe patience is on their side. "Just the update to the trust. It is standard. Nothing changes for you except clarity," he said, sliding the papers closer again, as if repetition could turn uncertainty into agreement. And then he added something softer but sharper underneath it. "You are not managing things well since Mom passed. I am trying to help you avoid mistakes." And that sentence landed differently than the others. Not because it was louder, but because it reduced me into something smaller than I recognized myself to be. I felt Sarah's presence still somewhere in the building, not visible, but remembered, like a warning that had not finished speaking. And I asked Kevin one simple question. "Who prepared these documents?" And he answered too quickly. "The firm did. The estate advisory group we have been working with." But I had worked with enough legal structures in my life to recognize when language was designed to avoid specificity, and I said, "No, Kevin, who authorized the change in the original trust structure." And for the first time his eyes broke away from mine for a fraction of a second, just long enough for silence to become meaningful. Then he placed both hands on the table and leaned forward slightly. "Dad, you are making this harder than it needs to be," he said. And there it was again, that word, harder, as if resistance itself was the problem rather than what was being resisted. I remember Eleanor's voice returning again in that moment, not as memory this time but as alignment, as if she had been preparing me for a pattern rather than a moment. "People reveal themselves when they believe urgency is on their side," she used to say, and I had never fully understood what she meant until now, because urgency was everywhere in this room, in Kevin's voice, in the timing of the documents, in the way the staff avoided eye contact when they passed the door. And then Kevin reached for a folder and opened it in front of me, tapping a page lightly. "We just need your signature here, and everything stays exactly as it is. You will not even notice a difference," he said. But I noticed something immediately that he did not expect me to notice. A section near the bottom labeled with a revision date that was too recent to match anything he had told me. And when I pointed at it, I said, "This was modified after Eleanor's passing, was it not?" The room did not change immediately, but Kevin did, not dramatically, just enough to show that the question had touched something he had not planned for. And he responded with a controlled laugh. "Dad, you are reading too much into dates. This is legal formatting, not a conspiracy." But the way he avoided the word amendment told me more than the sentence itself. And then he did something that shifted everything again. He reached over and gently closed the folder as if ending the conversation by physical force rather than agreement, and said, "You always did struggle with letting other people handle complexity, and for the first time I felt something older than confusion. I felt recognition of a pattern that had been repeating for years without me fully naming it. Moments where my understanding was treated as inconvenience, where my questions were reframed as instability, where my memory of events was subtly replaced with someone else's version of efficiency, and I heard myself say quietly, 'Your mother would never have allowed this pace.' And the instant I said it, the room changed again, not because of anger, but because Kevin reacted too quickly. 'Mom is not here anymore,' he said, and there was something almost accidental in his tone, like he had said more than he intended, and in that pause I noticed Sarah again in the corridor reflection, not entering, not interrupting, just watching. And Kevin continued, lowering his voice now, 'Look, Dad, I am trying to keep everything stable. You are grieving. You are not thinking clearly about paperwork, and I cannot let emotional decisions affect the estate.' And that word, estate, felt different in his mouth than it had earlier, less like inheritance and more like territory. And then he leaned closer and said something that I think he believed would finally end resistance. 'If you sign today, everything stays in the family exactly as I have structured it.' And I remember feeling the weight of that sentence because it implied ownership of something that had not been given. And in that moment I understood what Sarah had meant when she said, 'My file did not match authorization timeline,' because nothing here was being asked. It was being guided. And then Kevin made the mistake that changed the direction of everything. He reached for my pen, not offering it, not placing it gently, but taking it from the table and placing it directly in front of my hand as if the decision had already been made and my role was only to confirm it. And as the pen touched the paper, I noticed for the first time a small annotation on the margin of the document that did not belong to any legal formatting I had ever seen. A note that simply read, "Eleanor Mitchell Contingency Layer 3 Active," and I felt the room narrow around that line because it was not Kevin's voice anymore, not the staff, not the urgency, but something placed there long before any of us had walked into this building. And Kevin said softly, almost impatiently, "Just sign, Dad." And I looked at him and realized he had no idea what had just been activated beneath everything he thought he was controlling. The pen was still resting between my fingers when the door opened again, not the soft, cautious opening of staff or assistants, but a firm, deliberate movement that carried authority into the room before the person even stepped inside. And I remember Kevin straightening almost instinctively, like his posture had been trained to respond to certain types of presence. But I did not look away from the document in front of me, because something about that small line of text had changed the temperature of everything I thought I understood. And then I heard a voice I had not heard in nearly 20 years say my name, Robert Mitchell, calm, steady, unmistakably formal, and in that instant the room became something else entirely. I slowly lifted my eyes and saw a man standing in the doorway wearing a dark tailored suit, silver hair neatly combed, posture unchanged by time, and for a moment my memory refused to match him to the present until it did, until recognition arrived like a door finally unlocking. "Colonel David Harrington," I said quietly, and I felt Kevin shift beside me, not understanding the weight of that name, but I did. Because men like Harrington do not appear in rooms like this by accident. He stepped forward slowly, his eyes scanning the documents on the table before resting on me, and I noticed something subtle in his expression, not surprise, but recalibration, like he was adjusting the reality of what he was seeing against something he already knew. "I was told there was an estate signing in progress," he said calmly, placing a leather folder on the edge of the table without taking his eyes off me. And Kevin immediately tried to reclaim control of the moment. "Yes, sir. This is a private family matter. We are just finalizing standard updates." But Harrington did not respond to him, not immediately. Instead, he looked at the document again and then at the small annotation I had just noticed, and then back at me. And for the first time since I had entered this building, I saw uncertainty in someone else's posture instead of my own. "These are not standard updates," he said quietly, not as a question but as confirmation. And then he said my name again, softer this time. "Robert, I did not expect to see you in a situation like this." And that sentence alone shifted everything because it told me this was not a stranger. This was someone who knew the shape of my past. Kevin frowned. "Do you two know each other?" he asked quickly, and Harrington finally turned his attention toward him. Not aggressively, not dismissively, just with the kind of still focus that makes a room feel smaller. Your father and I served on the same Federal Advisory Logistics panel years ago, he said, and Kevin nodded slightly, but I could see it meant nothing to him, because he had never lived in the world where those panels mattered. But I had, and Harrington continued, which is why I am very interested in why his signature is being requested under conditions that bypass independent legal verification. The word bypass landed heavily in the room, and Sarah's absence suddenly felt more intentional than before, as if she had stepped out of the structure of this moment to allow something else to enter it. Kevin immediately leaned forward. There is nothing improper happening here. My father is simply updating his trust with guidance from licensed professionals. But Harrington raised one hand slightly, not to interrupt him rudely, but to stop the pace of the conversation itself. And when he spoke again, his voice had changed only slightly, but enough to make it clear that the direction of the room had shifted. Mr. Mitchell, he said to Kevin, I have reviewed estate transition frameworks for over 15 years in advisory capacity, and I can tell you with certainty that when urgency is combined with pre-populated amendments and restricted independent counsel, it is no longer standard practice. The room went quiet in a way that felt structured, like even the air was waiting for clarification. Kevin's expression tightened. Are you accusing someone of something? He asked, and Harrington finally looked at him directly. I am saying your father should not sign anything until his full legal chain of authorization is independently verified, and then he placed a second document on the table, sliding it gently toward me. I was contacted this morning by a compliance officer who flagged irregular modifications to a Mitchell family trust structure registered under Eleanor Mitchell's estate file, and when I heard her name spoken aloud in this room, something inside me shifted again, not emotionally, but structurally, like a long-held assumption had been removed and replaced by something heavier. Kevin froze for the first time since I had arrived. Not fully, but enough for me to notice. And Harrington continued, Robert, your wife left specific administrative protections in place, but someone has activated an override sequence that requires dual verification, which means any signing done today may not reflect original intent. Kevin interrupted sharply. This is ridiculous. She is gone. There is no override. But Harrington did not raise his voice. He simply said, and yet here we are. And that was when I saw it, not in the papers, not in the room, but in Kevin's face, a flicker of something he had not prepared for, because control always feels permanent until someone else shows up who understands the system better than you do. I looked down at the pen again, still in my hand, and for the first time I did not see it as a decision point. I saw it as a transfer point, and Harrington leaned slightly closer to me and said in a lower voice, Robert, I am not here to interpret family conflict. I am here because your wife anticipated something that has now been triggered. And in that moment, I realized this was no longer about whether I signed or did not sign. It was about what had already been set in motion long before any of us entered this room. And Kevin, still trying to regain footing, said the one thing that made the air feel even thinner. Dad, just finish this so we can all move forward. And Colonel Harrington looked at him for a long moment before answering quietly. I'm afraid it is already moving forward without your permission. Colonel Harrington's words hung in the room like a quiet alarm that no one had fully learned how to respond to yet, and for a moment no one spoke. Not Kevin, not the staff outside the glass, not even me, because there are moments in life when silence is not absence of sound but the presence of something reorganizing itself. And I felt that happening as I sat there with the pen still between my fingers, and then Harrington looked at me again, not at Kevin, not at the documents, but directly at me, and said in a lower voice, Robert, I need to confirm something before this proceeds any further. And Kevin immediately stepped forward. There is nothing to confirm. This is a private family estate matter. But Harrington did not acknowledge him this time. Instead, he placed his hand on the second folder and opened it slowly, revealing pages that looked older, not in paper age, but in structure, as if they belonged to a system designed with a different level of authority. And then he said something that made the air feel heavier. This file references a Mitchell protocol designation that has not been active in over a decade. I saw Kevin pause at the word protocol, not understanding it fully, but I understood enough to feel something tighten in my chest, because protocol designations were never casual language. They belonged to systems, not families. And Harrington continued, Your name appears in Federal Advisory Logistics Frameworks under clearance tied to emergency estate continuity planning. And I felt Kevin turn slightly toward me for the first time with something closer to confusion than control. What is he talking about? Kevin asked sharply, and I realized then that my son had never once asked the correct version of that question. Because the correct question was not what is he talking about, but what did I never know? Harrington finally stepped closer to the table, lowering his voice just enough that it felt like it belonged only to me. Robert, do you remember serving on the National Logistics Continuity Advisory Group during the early restructuring years? And I nodded slowly because I did, but I had never spoken about it at home. Not because it was secret, but because it had never felt like something that belonged in a kitchen conversation. And then he said, "You were not just a participant, you were part of the framework design team for continuity authorization structures tied to estate-level asset control under federal review conditions." And I felt Kevin shift again, this time fully turning toward me, because those words did not match the version of me he had built in his mind. And I heard myself say quietly, "That was a long time ago." But Harrington shook his head. "Not in the system, it was not." And he tapped the document once. "Some of your signatures are still embedded in active compliance architecture." And for the first time I saw Sarah Collins appear again at the doorway, hesitating as if she had stepped closer to something she was not supposed to re-enter, and she said softly, "I flagged it because the clearance hierarchy did not align with civilian trust processing." And Kevin snapped, "She is a receptionist. What clearance hierarchy?" But Harrington turned slightly toward him and said calmly, "She is correct to be concerned," then looked back at me. "Your wife knew this." And at that moment something inside me shifted, because Eleanor had never spoken about federal frameworks, but she had always asked questions that felt too precise for a private person, questions about authorization layers, about redundancy, about who should be allowed to override urgency. And I remembered one evening in Seattle when she had placed a folder on the table and said, "If something ever feels too fast, it is not because it is efficient, it is because someone benefits from you not stopping." I had thought she meant life decisions, not legal structures. And now Harrington was unfolding a version of reality that suggested she had understood systems I had long assumed were unrelated to home life. Kevin leaned forward again, frustration replacing confusion. "Dad, this is exactly why we needed to simplify everything. All of this old government language is irrelevant to your current estate." And that sentence landed differently than the others, because it treated my history as decay rather than context. And Harrington responded immediately, "It is not irrelevant if it governs authorization chains connected to his identity verification layer." And then he turned a page and placed it directly in front of me, pointing at a line that read, "Mitchell Tier 1 Continuity Reference Active under Legacy Conditions." And I felt the room tilt slightly, not physically, but in meaning, because that phrase implied continuity, not retirement. And Kevin finally said something quieter. "Dad, what does that even mean?" And for the first time I looked at him without seeing only my son. I saw someone who had built an entire understanding of me based on absence of information, and I said slowly, "It means I was part of structures that do not disappear just because I stopped talking about them." And the room went still again. But Harrington was not finished, because he added, "It also means your wife's estate planning did not start after her passing. It started when she understood what access your name still carried." And that was the moment I felt it. Not as revelation, but as recognition, because Eleanor had not been reacting to wealth or family conflict. She had been reacting to systems, and Kevin suddenly looked smaller, not in age, but in understanding, because he realized for the first time that the documents in front of him were not just papers to be signed. They were nodes in something larger than his control, and Sarah spoke again quietly from the doorway. The compliance system would have stopped this if the override had not been validated by legacy authority. And Kevin turned sharply. "What legacy authority?" And Harrington answered before I could. "His." And the word landed without drama but with complete finality. And suddenly every assumption Kevin had been operating under began to collapse, not through accusation, but through structure. And I felt the pen still in my hand, no longer as a decision tool, but as something suddenly meaningless in a room where decisions had already been made long before any of us arrived. And I realized then that the most important truth of this moment was not what I had been asked to sign, but what had already been signed in my name without anyone in this room fully understanding when it began. I remember the exact moment the room stopped feeling like a negotiation and started feeling like a courtroom without a judge. Because Colonel Harrington had not raised his voice once. Sarah Collins was still standing near the doorway like she no longer belonged to the company that employed her. And Kevin was no longer speaking in sentences that sounded like plans, but in fragments that sounded like escape routes. "This is being misunderstood," he said quickly, turning toward Harrington. "There are administrative updates that were approved through proper channels." But his voice had changed. It was no longer controlled. It was compressed, like something inside him was losing structural integrity. Harrington did not respond immediately. He simply placed the documents back on the table in a way that made them feel final rather than temporary, and then he said, "Mr. Kevin Mitchell, there are no valid authorization records matching the sequence you are describing." And I watched Kevin blink twice as if the sentence itself had not fully translated in his mind yet. And then he turned toward me. "Dad, tell them this is normal. You understand these systems. Just explain it." But there was something fragile in that request, as if he was no longer trying to control the situation, only trying to reattach it to me. And for the first time, I did not feel anger. I felt clarity, because clarity is what arrives when emotion finally steps aside. And I looked at him and said calmly, "No, Kevin, I do not recognize this process, and I did not authorize any changes being presented today." And the silence that followed was immediate, not dramatic, but absolute, like the room itself had agreed to record that sentence as fact. Sarah stepped forward slightly then, holding a tablet in her hands, her voice careful but no longer uncertain. "I have cross-checked the internal audit log," she said, and she looked at me briefly before continuing. "The amendment sequence was initiated under a delegated authority chain tied to temporary power of attorney status activated after Mrs. Eleanor Mitchell's passing." Kevin immediately reacted. "That is exactly what I told you. This is standard delegation." But Harrington interrupted him quietly, not sharply, just precisely. "It would be standard if the originating consent had not been flagged as contested within the same 24-hour window." And that phrase changed everything. Because contested is not a feeling in legal language, it is a trigger, and I saw Kevin's posture change again. Not forward this time, but backward, as if distance could restore control. "This is being blown out of proportion," he said. But no one in the room agreed with him anymore, not even the staff outside the glass. And then Sarah did something that shifted the balance further. She placed another sheet on the table, sliding it carefully toward Harrington, and said, "This is the original verification note from Mrs. Mitchell's estate attorney. It was filed prior to her passing." And I leaned forward slightly, not because I expected revelation, but because I felt recognition approaching. And Harrington read it first, then looked at me, and said, "Robert, your wife anticipated administrative override attempts under stress conditions." And Kevin suddenly laughed once, short and disbelieving. "You are all talking like she set up some kind of conspiracy." And that word, conspiracy, hung in the air until Harrington responded calmly, "No, Mr. Mitchell. It is called structured foresight in estate law when a principal asset holder anticipates undue influence." And I felt something inside me settle into place because Eleanor had never trusted simplicity when it came to people under pressure. And Kevin was now fully under pressure because his voice changed again when he said, "Dad, you are going to let them ruin everything I have built here." And I looked at him and realized for the first time that what he was afraid of was not loss of truth, but loss of outcome. And I said softly, "Kevin, I am not ruining anything. I am only stating what I know." And that sentence seemed to land heavier than any accusation in the room, because it was not emotional, it was procedural, and Harrington nodded slightly. "That is the correct framing," he said. And then he turned toward Kevin. "At this point, any further execution of these documents without independent review would constitute a procedural violation under fiduciary conduct standards." And Kevin stepped back from the table, his breathing now visible in the way his shoulders moved. "This is insane," he said. "This is supposed to be a family matter." And Sarah responded quietly, almost reluctantly. "Family matters do not override verified consent structures." And that was when Kevin finally stopped speaking for a full moment, because there was nothing left in the room that supported his version of reality. And I noticed something else then, not in Kevin, but in myself, because I was no longer reacting to him as a son or as a threat or as confusion. I was simply observing the structure of what had been built around us. And and Harrington said quietly, "Robert, there is one more element you have not reviewed." And he opened the final folder, placing it directly in front of me, and I saw my wife's name at the top again, Eleanor Mitchell. But beneath it there was something I had never seen before, a clause labeled Primary Continuity Authorization retained by spousal oversight until manual revocation, and I heard Kevin say, almost instinctively, "That cannot exist without my approval." And Harrington replied without hesitation, "It does not require your approval, it requires hers." And for the first time, Kevin did not respond immediately, and in that pause I understood something I had not understood in years, that the system I thought I had stepped away from had never actually stopped recognizing me. It had simply been waiting, and then Sarah spoke again, softer now, almost as if she was no longer speaking to us, but confirming something she had already accepted. "The override condition has already been validated," she said, and I asked quietly, "Validated by whom?" And she looked at me and answered, "By the only signature that was designed to survive uncertainty." And Kevin whispered, "What signature?" But I already knew the answer before anyone said it out loud, because Eleanor had never trusted one layer of truth. And in that moment, I realized the room was no longer deciding anything. It was only revealing what had already been decided long before any of us arrived. I remember the exact moment the room stopped feeling like it belonged to any single person, because the air itself began to fracture into separate conversations happening at the same time. And for the first time since we entered the Scottsdale facility, I was no longer the center of pressure. I was simply the point around which everything else was breaking apart. Kevin was the first to speak, but not to me, to the room, to Sarah, to Colonel Harrington, as if increasing volume could restore authority. "This is not what was agreed," he said sharply, his voice no longer controlled but exposed. "These documents were processed under standard estate authority. I followed every instruction given by the advisory firm." And that was the first crack, because Harrington did not respond. Sarah did not respond immediately, and silence has a way of making certainty sound like doubt. Then Sarah finally spoke, and her voice was different now, less cautious, more procedural. "Mr. Mitchell, I need to correct that statement," she said, looking at Kevin directly for the first time without hesitation. "The advisory firm did not originate this sequence. They only executed what was already pre-authorized under legacy continuity conditions." And I watched Kevin's face change in real time, not into understanding, but into resistance trying to become logic. "That is not possible," he said immediately, turning toward her. "I spoke directly with their compliance director yesterday, and Harrington finally stepped in, but not toward Kevin, toward the table, placing one hand lightly on the file, as if stabilizing the situation itself. And that compliance director," Harrington said calmly, "has already submitted a correction notice confirming misalignment between initiation source and execution authority." And for the first time, Kevin did not have an immediate answer, because there are moments when a system stops being something you can argue with and becomes something that simply records what has already happened. And I noticed something subtle then, not in Kevin alone, but in the staff behind the glass. Two people speaking quietly now, one gesturing toward the internal terminal, the other shaking their head. And I understood that this was no longer a private negotiation. It had become an internal audit in real time. Kevin turned back toward me suddenly, desperation breaking through control. "Dad, tell them this is unnecessary. You know, this is just administrative confusion." And I felt something shift in me, because for the first time I was not being asked to comply. I was being asked to restore someone else's version of reality. And I said quietly, "Kevin, I have not confirmed any of these changes, and I did not authorize the structure you are describing." And that sentence did not escalate anything. It simply removed his anchor, and I saw it immediately, because when a person loses their anchor, they do not fall quietly. They search for something to hold on to. And Kevin turned sharply towards Sarah. "You are misunderstanding the system," he said, his tone now defensive rather than commanding. "I have full delegated authority under the Mitchell Estate Transition Framework." And Sarah shook her head slightly, not in disagreement but in confirmation of something already concluded. "You had conditional delegation," she replied, "which is invalidated upon activation of dual override verification." And I saw Kevin process that phrase incorrectly at first, as if he believed repeating the structure of control would re-establish it. No, that is not how it works," he said quickly, stepping closer to the table. I signed the initiation request myself, but Harrington finally looked at him directly now, and when he spoke his voice carried the kind of certainty that does not invite debate. It ends it. You did not sign an initiation request, he said. You signed a facilitation acknowledgement under incomplete disclosure parameters. And I watched Kevin freeze, not because he understood everything, but because he understood enough. And then something unexpected happened. The conflict stopped being directed at me and turned inward. Kevin pivoted suddenly toward the hallway where another staff member had appeared. This is your fault, he said sharply, pointing. You told me this was cleared for execution today. And the staff member immediately responded, hands raised defensively. We processed what was provided through your office, and just like that the chain began to unravel. Because every explanation was now pointing to another explanation, and no one wanted ownership of the origin point, Harrington observed quietly. This is consistent with delegation cascade failure, and Sarah added, almost reluctantly, there is a mismatch between authorization intent and execution layer, and Kevin's voice rose again. But now it was no longer aimed at control. It was aimed at survival. Someone in this room altered documentation after submission, he said, looking around. This is manipulation. And the irony of that word did not escape me, because for the first time he was using the same language I had been hearing about myself. Harrington did not react emotionally. He simply placed a printed audit log on the table. The system log shows sequential modification initiated from the advisory side, he said, not the beneficiary side, and Kevin immediately shook his head. That is incorrect. I need to speak to legal. But even as he said it, I could hear the collapse in his certainty, because legal was no longer a single person he could call. It was now a structure already speaking in this room through documents he had not fully read. Sarah turned slightly toward Harrington. If the override condition has been validated under legacy authorization, she said carefully, then any further attempt to enforce current signing protocol would trigger compliance reversal, and that phrase, reversal, changed Kevin's expression again, because now it was no longer about winning. It was about undoing consequences, and he said quickly, we can fix this, just pause everything. But Harrington shook his head once. Systems that have already executed cannot be paused without audit escalation. And in that moment, I realized something important. I was no longer being pressured. I was no longer being controlled. I was simply witnessing the consequences of a structure that Kevin had believed he could bend, and now could not. Kevin turned back to me one last time, and there was something almost unguarded in his voice. Dad, I was trying to protect everything, he said. But even that statement began to fracture as he spoke it, because protection and control had become indistinguishable to him, and I answered him quietly, without anger, without accusation, I believe you thought you were. And that was the moment he broke away from certainty completely, not into silence, but into fragmentation, turning towards Sarah, then Harrington, then the staff, searching for a version of the room that would agree with him, but the room no longer belonged to agreement. It belonged to record, and Harrington finally closed the folder in front of him and said calmly, at this stage, the only thing left is validation of what has already occurred, and I realized then that I had not needed to fight for control at any point, because control had already been redistributed long before any of us entered the building, and Kevin stood there, no longer issuing instructions, no longer negotiating, simply trying to locate where authority had gone, while everyone else in the room quietly stopped defending positions they could no longer maintain. And in that silence I understood something unexpected, that sometimes collapse does not come from one decision, but from every small assumption finally refusing to hold its weight at the same time. I remember the moment everything stopped feeling like a battle, not because anything was resolved in a dramatic way, but because my body finally understood that I no longer needed to stay inside that room to survive what was happening in it. Colonel Harrington had stepped back from the table. Sarah Collins had lowered her tablet as if the system she was monitoring no longer required her constant attention, and Kevin, for the first time since we arrived in Scottsdale, was not speaking at all. He was simply standing there, staring at documents that no longer behaved the way he expected them to behave, and I realized something quiet and unexpected, that clarity does not always arrive with answers. Sometimes it arrives when confusion simply loses its authority over you. Harrington spoke first, his tone no longer procedural but settled. Robert, at this point the system will continue its own compliance review independent of any family input, he said, and I nodded slowly. not because I fully understood every technical layer, but because I finally understood what no longer required my participation. Kevin turned slightly toward me then, his voice lower now, almost unsteady. Dad, we can still fix this. We can just step back and go home and sort it out privately. And I looked at him for a long moment, not as a son trying to recover control, but as someone who had mistaken control for protection, and I said quietly, Kevin, I am not trying to win anything anymore. And that sentence seemed to unsettle him more than any legal document had, because there was no argument left inside it, only distance. Sarah stepped forward slightly, her voice softer now. Mr. Mitchell, the review process will take time, but nothing further requires your signature today. And I felt something in my chest loosen at those words, not relief in a dramatic sense, but the absence of pressure, like stepping out of a room that had been holding its breath for too long. Harrington closed his folder with a calm finality and added, Your wife's structure did exactly what it was designed to do. It prevented irreversible decisions under emotional pressure, and when he said her name again, Eleanor, it no longer felt like a trigger. It felt like presence, not absence. And I suddenly understood that everything I had experienced in that room was not an attack on me, but a system reacting exactly as she had designed it to react when urgency replaced consent. Kevin finally sat down, not defeated in the way people expect, but exhausted in a way that stripped performance away. And he said quietly, almost to himself, I thought I was helping, and I believed him, not because the outcome was harmless, but because intention and impact had finally separated in a way neither of us could ignore anymore. I walked to the edge of the room then, not because I was dismissed, but because I no longer needed to remain at the center of it. Sarah followed me with her eyes and said gently, Mr. Mitchell, there will be follow-up correspondence through proper legal channels. And I nodded once, understanding that life would continue in paperwork and process long after this moment ended, but it no longer felt like something I had to stand inside to endure. Harrington approached as I reached the door, and for the first time his voice carried something closer to familiarity than authority. Robert, you did not lose control of anything today, he said. You simply saw where it had already been distributed. And I thought about that sentence as I stepped into the hallway. The cooler air outside the conference room, feeling almost ordinary after everything that had just happened. Kevin's voice called softly behind me, not commanding, not resisting, just human. Dad, he said, and I turned back briefly, and there was nothing left to argue over in his expression, only distance trying to become understanding. Are you going to be okay? He asked. And I answered honestly without promise or performance. I already am, and I meant it in a way I would not have been able to say a few hours earlier, because being okay was no longer about outcomes or control. It was about no longer standing inside systems that required me to be something I was not. I left the building slowly, not because I was leaving conflict behind in triumph, but because I no longer needed to carry it forward. The Arizona air was warm in a way that felt almost indifferent to everything that had just occurred inside those glass walls. And as I stood outside for a moment, I thought about Eleanor not as a mystery to be solved, but as a life that had been quietly preparing for inevitabilities I never saw coming. I thought about Kevin not as an opponent, but as someone still learning the difference between protection and possession. And I thought about myself, not as someone who had been pulled into something, but as someone who had finally been allowed to step out of it. And in that quiet space between building and horizon, I realized that what remained was not victory, not loss, but something far more ordinary and far more valuable. The ability to go home without carrying the weight of a room that no longer belonged to me. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. The morning light in Scottsdale felt different when I returned the next day, not because the desert had changed, but because I had changed the way I experienced it. The building where everything had unfolded now looked quieter, less like a place of pressure, and more like a place that had simply finished revealing what it needed to reveal. I stood outside for a moment before entering, noticing how ordinary life continued around it, cars passing, people walking, conversations happening that had nothing to do with what had happened inside those glass walls. And that contrast alone made everything inside me settle into something calmer. Colonel Harrington was already there when I arrived, not in a hurry, not surrounded by urgency, just present, as if the situation had already moved into its final stage without needing performance. Sarah Collins was at the front desk again, but her posture had changed, less uncertain now, more grounded, like someone who had crossed a line of understanding and could not return to ignorance even if she wanted to. Kevin was not in the main room when I first entered, and that absence said more than his presence ever could. Harrington looked up as I approached and said quietly, "The compliance review has been escalated to final validation." I nodded, not because I fully followed every procedural detail, but because I understood the direction of it now. Things were no longer being decided. They were being recorded. Sarah approached slowly and placed a sealed document on the counter, her voice careful but steady. "Mr. Mitchell, the advisory firm has formally withdrawn from execution authority pending investigation." And for a moment, I thought about how quickly confidence can dissolve when structure is questioned from above. Harrington added, "Your son's delegated access has been suspended under fiduciary review protocol." And I did not feel satisfaction. I felt distance, because consequences in systems like this are rarely emotional, they are procedural. Kevin finally appeared from the hallway a few minutes later, but he looked different than the man I had followed into this place. Not defeated in a dramatic sense, but stripped of certainty, the kind of quiet exhaustion that comes when control stops responding to intention. He stopped a few feet away from me and said, "Dad." I did not understand what I was stepping into, and I believed him, not because everything he had done was harmless, but because misunderstanding can exist alongside responsibility. I replied softly, "I know." And that was the first time he did not try to correct the situation with explanation. Harrington stepped slightly aside, giving the moment space rather than direction, and Sarah looked down at her hands briefly before speaking. "The estate structure will revert to original trustee designation pending legal confirmation," and I felt the weight of those words not as loss or gain, but as restoration. Not everything needed to be taken back. Some things simply returned to where they were always meant to be. Kevin exhaled slowly, and, for the first time, his voice was not defensive. "I thought I was protecting everything," he said again, but this time it sounded less like justification and more like realization. I looked at him for a long moment and said, "Protection without understanding becomes control, and control always creates distance." He did not respond immediately, because there was nothing left to argue against, only something to absorb. In the following hours, the building shifted into procedural closure. Documents were collected, systems updated, confirmations recorded, and through all of it I noticed something I had not expected. No one was celebrating, no one was defeated. The atmosphere was simply resolving itself into normality again, as if the entire event had been a disruption that needed to be integrated back into order. Harrington approached me before I left and said, "Your wife was precise in ways most people never fully appreciate until much later." I nodded, because that was the closest explanation anyone had given for Eleanor's quiet intelligence. Sarah walked me to the exit and paused before speaking. "I have seen many families go through estate transitions," she said, "but I have rarely seen one where the planning protected both the assets and the people." And I understood what she meant without needing more detail. Outside again, the air felt unchanged, but I was no longer the same person breathing it. Kevin stood near the entrance for a moment longer, then said quietly, "Are you going back to Seattle?" And I answered, "Yes." And after a pause, he added, "I think I need to understand things better." And I replied, "That usually takes time you cannot rush." There was no final reconciliation, no dramatic closure, only the beginning of something more honest between distance and understanding. Days later, I returned to Seattle and entered the house Eleanor and I had built together. The silence there was no longer heavy. It was familiar. I walked into her study where everything still carried her quiet order, and I opened the small safe she had always insisted remained untouched. Inside was not a dramatic secret, but something far more intentional: structured documents, letters, and a final note in her handwriting, explaining not what she had taken from anyone, but what she had preserved, not for control, but for stability when emotion replaced clarity. I sat there for a long time holding that note, realizing she had never tried to control the future. She had simply prepared for the moment when people would forget how fragile certainty becomes under pressure. In the weeks that followed, Kevin called less about conflict and more about understanding, and I answered when I could, not to correct him, but to let him think. Harrington sent a final confirmation that all systems had stabilized, and Sarah's last message was simply a thank you for how the situation resolved without escalation. Life did not return to what it was before. It returned to something quieter, something more deliberate. Kevin eventually stepped away from direct involvement in estate matters, not as punishment, but as recognition that authority without comprehension is unsustainable, and I learned something I should have understood earlier, that families do not break in single moments. They shift gradually until someone finally notices the weight of what has been accumulating. Months later, I found myself sitting on the back porch in Seattle watching the wind move through the trees. Eleanor used to love, holding a simple brass key from her study safe between my fingers, worn smooth at the edges from years of quiet storage. Not a symbol of power, but of preparation, and I understood then that what she left behind was not control, and not protection alone, but a kind of trust in time itself. That truth would eventually surface when pressure stopped speaking louder than understanding. And as I set the key down on the wooden table beside me, I realized the most important thing she had ever taught me was not how to hold on, but how to let life reveal itself without forcing it to obey fear. And in that stillness, I finally understood that peace is not what remains after conflict. It is what exists when you no longer need conflict to define what is real. Thank you for listening to this story. And if it reminded you of someone in your own life, or a moment where you had to choose between control and understanding, I hope you carry that reflection gently, not as weight, but as awareness. Sometimes the most important strength is simply knowing when to step out of the room and let truth speak for itself. And if you ever find yourself in stories like this again, remember that clarity does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrives quietly after everything else stops demanding your attention. And there are more stories like this waiting for you. Stories about family, truth, loss, and unexpected understanding, so feel free to explore them in the playlist, and perhaps you will find something there that speaks to your own experience, something that feels familiar in a way you did not expect, and wherever you are watching from. I am grateful you stayed until the end. Thank you for listening to this story.